Hi, this is Jeffrey Wernick. I'm Jeffrey Wernick, I should say, and welcome to another Fein Points here. That means we're here, of course, with Bruce, and we're also very happy that that today we also have Ryan again joining us. So, hi, Bruce. Hi, Ryan. Great to see both of you, and as always, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So. Given that this is Fein Points, Ryan, if you don't mind, I always like to start off with Bruce and then go to you. I have no prefatory comments today, so Bruce, why don't you tell us how you'd like to start off this conversation?
Well, with regard to the United States, again, it's the use of the Marines and the National Guard out in California, Los Angeles. This was an event, and this with protests all the time, and I myself, having lived through the Vietnam War era, this was a tea party compared to the kinds of demonstrations that were against the Vietnam War. There was certainly vandalism. The local law enforcement was making arrests. There was no idea that this was an invasion or rebellion. I remember one day in May in 1970 in Washington, D.C., they made 12,000 arrests. They would bring in the Marines, bring in the National Guard. Police are up to this. And then Mr. Trump makes this absurd statement that there's invasion and rebellion, sends in Marines, sends in the National Guard, federalizes it. The governor wasn't asking for it. And there certainly was violence, some, but it was more sporadic than systemic and is properly punished like it should be. Curfew was imposed. And this, I think, was the 8th or 9th time now in this short second term where Mr. Trump has declared a national emergency out there, Remember, he said a national emergency with a few drops of fentanyl coming in from Canada so he could impose tariffs on that, a national emergency because Venezuela is attacking the United States, a national emergency because we have an energy deficit, even though it's the greatest energy surplus we've ever had. So he's destroying the meaning of emergency. And he's trying to create an atmosphere that suggests, I think, trying to intimidate judges so that they'll accept anything that he does, because after all, without national emergency powers, the country faces an existential threat, which is really quite alarming, in part because it's really tracks very closely what happened in Nazi Germany when Adolf Hitler came in. 1933, the Enabling Act, Article 48 of the Weimar Republic invoked national emergency, suspend the Constitution, change the Constitution by executive order. And within a year, the parliament in Germany was nothing, and we simply had rule by decree. And that's what we're approaching today right now in the United States. We have more institutional bulwarks, at least in the courts, than were available in Nazi Germany. But if we don't push back, the courts can't do it on their own. Ultimately, a president can defy a court order if he's got the public behind him and Congress is being anemic. And I think that's where we're headed right now.
I saw Karen Bass is the mayor of LA's press conference yesterday. I also saw a segment of Arnold Schwarzenegger on Jimmy Kimmel, and I think Newsom's made the same point. And the point is, I think there's been some, places like Fox and other, media channels that are aligned with Trump have made claims that the mainstream media is not covering all the acts of violence. But the description that's been given by Schwarzenegger, Bass, and Newsom, and I don't think anyone has said it's not true, is that if you take a look at all the square footage, the area that comprises Los Angeles, that more than 99% of it, more than 99.9% of the area is completely free of protests. So I don't know how you can say the California is, and I want to add another point to that also. In the press conference yesterday, where Padilla was manhandled by security and then handcuffed, ridden to the ground and handcuffed. What Noam was said that I saw in one of the videos at the beginning, she was saying they came to liberate California from its socialist government. So what she claimed was making a claim that they were there for regime change. So because she was not looking to keep the city safe. She thought the city needed to be kept safe from the government that's a socialist regime, and that they have to. So basically, the criminals are maybe Padilla and Newsom and Bass and other are the criminals, and they're there to make sure, that they don't get to govern the state. And maybe this is a hostile takeover where they're using the military to take it over, because those are basically her words. So her words were they were liberating the citizens from the government. So that sounds very different than, I guess, what they're telling the courts. I guess they're not going to courts. I want her to go to under oath and say the same thing under oath, that she's there to liberate the state from the, from the people that the people elected to represent their interests.
Yeah, but think of this it's even worse, Jeffrey, because what gives her power under the U.S. Constitution to liberate, a state from what her view of socialism is?
Can I jump in really quick, guys? I think
go ahead, Brian.
Because we go over that. Like, I think that's a really important part to go into. But I think before we go into that, I think it's worth, I think, in my opinion, highlighting, or like the way I see it, that's not what she really believes. I think these are narratives being given to people in the audience that want to believe they're the rebels fighting against the deep state, or some rebellion against the, some 1776 duo. Like, that's what they want to feel, right? So I think it's important to go back to I think all these people are dishonest from my perspective. The left, the right, the government, I think this is about trying to manipulate us into a very clear position. And I think what's interesting is, from the protests, I agree that it's always like that. One side's always saying violence is everywhere. One side's always trying to act like it's diminished. The reality is it's not what they're claiming it is. But what's important, I think we all agree on, is that regardless of even if it's exactly how they're framing, that doesn't then immediately invalidate everybody else who might want to protest against what are provable crimes being committed by the government, by ICE. So it's important to see both sides of how that's played. But bringing it back to the point about the rebellion, I think it's obvious. And I would really like to touch on the Marines, National Guard, and specifically, Bruce, your thoughts on the legalities of where that is right now, because it's clear that it's justifying these actions, so if they're able to, at least, just like the Venezuela and Enemies Aliens Act, if he can drive in this narrative that this is an actual rebellion from Mexico, even though right before that, their argument was it was lefties fighting for immigrants, then it just merged into a Mexican invasion somehow, it's clearly that they can claim it's an insurrection or a rebellion, and then they can sort of invalidate the idea of the Posse Comitatus Act and, a lot of other things. So I think I would like your guys' thoughts on that.
And yesterday, I just want to add one that, and then I'll go to Bruce to comment on it, and then I'll comment on it. But yesterday, there was also the addition on I think it was Mace, Nancy Mace, or Annie Paula Luna. One of the two said that this is all funded by the Chinese. So
interesting.
So now this is all organized by the Communist Chinese Party to undercut the United States of America. So, and that the people involved are basically foreign agents. I'll make one personal statement on this that I have personal experience in. After the Gulf War, there had been the first Gulf War. There had been there had been no really relationship between Bush and Shamir. Shamir was the Israeli prime minister at the time of the first Gulf War. They had a conversation at the very early in Bush administration. They had a misunderstanding. Bush felt that Shamir lied to him, and they then no longer had direct contact until the Gulf War, when Bush reached out to Shamir and said, don't get engaged in the conflict. We'll send over some Patriot missiles. And we'll make sure that when the Iraqis launch their Scuds against it, we'll be there and we'll take care of you. And for Israel had never let a foreign military presence defend itself, because for Israel, having the ability to defend itself is something that Israel, has always been important for Israel's sense as a force of deterrence, that Israel doesn't need anyone's assistance. But a deal was cut. The deal that was cut was that Israel would accept the U.S.'s demands, and in return, this was a period of time when a lot of Russian Russian Jews were emigrating to Israel, and the deal was made that in return, the quid pro quo is that the U.S. would guarantee international debt that that Israel would place in the capital markets to fund the infrastructure needed to absorb, the migration of Russian Jews into Israel. Again, Israel would pay for the guarantee, but the U.S. and usually it's a subsidized price, but that they would get so Israel could access the capital markets in order to fund that. So the deal was made. After the Gulf War ended, Bush reneged on the deal. He decided not to give Israel the guarantees. So a bunch of people from the Jewish community throughout the United States gathered in a hotel room. I was there. I was one of the 1,400 people present at the room. I was one of the leaders, and the leaders in the sense of I wasn't directly involved in organizing it. I was peripherally involved. But what they did is when they had everybody in the group, they separated people into team leaders, and those team leaders were given assignments on who they should lobby that day. That they would go meet the people who they would lead into a meeting with a senator or a congressman, and basically each team leader was supposed to educate the people on proper decorum. Now, none of us were handled a script. Nobody came into the meeting, and no team leader was given a script. We just all knew that we were there to try and encourage the Congress to come up with a majority that would override a presidential veto, so that the U.S. would keep its word and guarantee and do the loan guarantees. So that's what we were there for. There was no instructions on the part of the Israeli government to do it. These are Jewish Americans, and many people who are not Jewish were there as well, who felt that there was a deal made and the U.S. should keep its word when it makes deals. And we were not happy that Bush got his end of the deal and then didn't live up to what our end of the deal was. So, so I was one of the team leaders who had a group of people. And basically, I never told people what to say. I just told them how they should behave when they're in a meeting with a senator or congressperson. So never interrupt. You listen to them, you speak very politely, so that's all basically, we told them. And, so, that was it. And while we're in the room, Bush came out and made a speech, and he called everyone in that room a foreign agent, okay, representing a foreign government. So he said, that's when he gave us, I'm this one lonely guy up on the hill, and all these people, all these foreign agents have descended into Washington in order to represent a foreign government and the interests of a foreign government. So I never had any communication with the Israeli government. I had nobody telling me what to say. All we were doing was a whole bunch of people who understood that the deal was made, and we expected the United States, because we think it's in our interest that when the United States makes deals with any foreign leaders, that we should keep our word. So that we want to preserve the reputation of the country as one, when it makes a deal, it keeps its word. So, and if it would have been another issue and it had nothing to do with Israel, I still would have been there, because I think that whenever we make a deal with other countries and they fulfill their end, we should fulfill our end. And I think that that's what the country stands for. So at that point in time, Bush did come up, and he did say that everybody there was a foreign agent. So this is basically the tactic, is that you want to be able to destroy the message by destroying the integrity of the messenger. So you never have to address the message.
But Jeffrey, this rodeo was before in Vietnam.
Yes.
I remember all the efforts that were told to LBJ. He kept coming back to the CIA. You got to say, all the Vietnam War protesters, they are being funded by foreign governments, by Soviet Union, by China, by Vietnam. Everyone's being 100% of the protesters, hundreds of thousands, millions. It was always foreign monies coming in and doing this. It's not any indigenous domestic opposition to the stupidity of the Vietnam War. And that was the line over and over again. It was true under LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, true under Nixon. They just can't accept that maybe they're doing something bad and stupid. And so they try to tarnish your message by claiming that you're unpatriotic and you're working from
But Bruce, don't you think
even when there's no evidence to support any of it?
And it works.
To
And
what
it
degree do you
works.
think they're lying though? Like, I know, I agree. Some of them might just not want to accept that they're the bad guy. But
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a pessimist. I'm sure you're aware by now that when it comes to government. But do you think, and what's your opinion? How many of them do you think know they're lying and are doing that to suppress just the narrative? Because there's nothing new under the sun. It's amazing how far that goes.
I think they all know they're lying. I think
I
every one of them,
agree. I agree. But I
I
was
think
curious.
every one of them knows that they're a liar. Okay, and every one of them knows that what they're doing is destroying the country, but they're willing to destroy the country to advance their interests of their own personal interest and their own party's interests. And
Yeah.
none of them care about the Constitution. None of them care about the United States of America. Okay, what they care about is power and more power and more power. That's all they care about.
See, Ryan, I don't think at present, I think that these politicians, I don't think that their intellectual universe deals with, truth and falsity. It only deals that's irrelevant to them. What helps me politically and what works. That's it.
Yeah, and then they've mentally meshed that with what's best interest of the country. Like they've conflated their interest with the country. It's like a megalomaniac kind of a thing. I think you're right.
Yeah, and remember, I mean, I don't know. Remember Charlie Wilson? What's good for General Motors is good for the United States. Really? Okay, not necessarily. Right. But anyway, that's the mindset of these people, and that's what's so different. If I can just take a little bit of a detour here, if you read the discussions at the highest levels at the time of the American Revolution, the leaders were saying we have to make this succeed for our posterity. They're not talking about aggrandizing themselves and getting rich and making speeches. They said we have to make this work. We're fighting right now, but we want to make sure we leave our heritage so that our successors and our children can live in peace. They can develop the arts, the literature, all the things that can make us prosperous or whatever. And they were the opposite of being self-aggrandizing people. That culture doesn't exist anymore. I mean, they said when George Washington, when he turned aside the ability to be a lifetime president or king, he didn't accept any pay during his service as commander of the armed forces in the Revolutionary War. He didn't even as president. He just took expenses. He didn't take anything else. That made him a legend from being a hero, right? We don't have any legends anymore. And it shows, in fact, that we lack at least the cultural restraints that are our only deliverance from the madness that we confront now. As Jeffrey calls morons, they have no ethics, they have no standards whatsoever other than me, 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 me. The kind of attitude that would have killed the American Revolution if we maintained that in 1776.
So I really think that we need to get back to a point in which, like you're describing, like the earliest point where these people had jobs. This was a duty, not a job, right? And so getting back to the idea where people serve their country as opposed to being a lifelong politician, one of many things, but I think that's a step in the right direction, most definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a oxymoron to call them public servants.
Yeah,
most definitely.
They're not public servants. None. And anyone who is in a senator, congressman, anyone's position that calls themselves a public service, they should be put in jail for defrauding the American public, for using words. When you do a commercial and you advertise and you falsely advertise your product, that's a crime. You can't falsely advertise your product. They falsely advertise themselves, all the time. And yes, going back, I think, they clearly they know that having conversations like this, are not helpful to, resolving conflict, trying to form a consensus and trying to solve problems together. Nobody, you're not going to solve a problem by walking. I do, a lot of negotiations, and no negotiation, I'm trying to get a deal done with somebody where there's differences of opinion. Do I go into the room and I tell somebody, you're a moron, you're an idiot, you're a liar, and take all my time insulting them and then think I'm going to have a good faith conversation with them? No, you're there to have a conversation to say, you disagree, I disagree. Let me hear what your points are. Let me hear, you listen to what my points are, but first I'll give you the opportunity to talk, because once I show you that I'm going to acknowledge your points, you're more likely to acknowledge my points. And then after a while, you can find a lot of things you can agree upon, and then certain things you don't agree upon. And, and then you can maybe agree to have a deal on the points you do agree upon. and then keep talking about the things you don't agree upon, and that's being an adult trying to solve a problem. And when you're an adult trying to solve a problem, okay, you can't take anything personally, and you can never make a personal attack on somebody, because the goal, that's then inconsistent with the state of objective if you're interested in solving a problem. Their behavior indicates there's no problem they want to solve, because nobody behaves that way who really wants to solve a problem.
No,
So
they don't. In fact, it's the opposite incentive. Jeffrey, they do not, if they have a problem that's a wedge issue, they want it to fester forever.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it benefits them politically, they don't care whether it's destroying the country. I mean, that's the perverse incentives that, that they have. And the other thing that drives, these people is that we've gone from a time where the vast majority of our public servants served a few years, sometimes longer, 2 terms. They went back into private life. They were not what I would call a professional politician whose whole life, like a Joe Biden from day one, is nothing but being in politics. So they looked at life as being substantially living under other people's rule, and they didn't have an incentive, since they weren't professional politicians, to trying to grow it, like a conglomerate or whatever. I mean, the government is so big. But once we decided, we wanted to be an empire, and the government began to go from a tiny acorn to big oak, they say, hey, this is great. You can have a lifetime service here. And the company I operate keeps growing bigger and bigger. I become more and more powerful, more and more favors I can do for friends. There's more and more money to spend. Then you gravitate people whose whole life is in politics. It's not true of everyone. But then the attraction that government has for crazy people who want nothing more than power becomes overwhelming. Right. Because, hey, you can be the most powerful person more than Julius Caesar, more than Napoleon, and it attracts crazy people. And that's what we see right now. I mean, right. Kristi Noem, if Kristi Noem was around at the time of the Constitutional Convention, they would have exiled her. We can't deal with it. She's now a cabinet member.
Look, yeah. Pete Hegseth, he was asked, is what Trump doing in California constitutional? He said, of course it is. And they said, can you cite where in the Constitution it is? And he said, I need to get back to you on that. So clearly, he's a liar, okay? If he asserted it was constitutional, he'd be able to cite where in the Constitution it is constitutional. But his answer was, it's constitutional, but when it comes to the citation, I need to get back to you on that, because I have no idea, really.
They're marching orders.
I just mouth these words, because it's what I'm expected to say.
Yeah, right. It's what they all know they're supposed to do. Like I don't think we discussed in the show, but I'm sure we're all aware, like with Bondi, and there's multiple examples of pushing people out, like with Garcia, who simply acknowledged the facts that are now proven to be the facts, and she got them out of the way because they didn't zealously defend their client or whatever her term was. It's just dishonesty, And so I think these people like Noam have been chosen because they're not smart enough to even recognize that, like you're saying, Bruce, that it's almost like not even aware that they're being dishonest, because their mind's so focused on the other side's the enemy, and whatever I have to do, even lying is okay because we're the right team. Like I think they're drinking their own Kool-Aid.
The mindset they have, and I've had people that I know who I think are reasonably intelligent people, who now describe this to me as basically saying we're in war. And all's fair in love and war. And so they think these are justifiable tactics because they think it's a war for the country. So basically they do view it as an existential crisis for America. They do view, and I think both parties have elements that view, the other party as existential threats.
Right.
And given the fact that they believe it's existential threats, they think any behavior that they do is justifiable, given what they think, the threat is. But I think also it is just a lot of lies. I mean, Kristi Noem's got it. Maybe the first night you could have called it a riot in LA, maybe the first night. But subsequent to the first night, it's just protests with sprinkling of some violence, but it's mostly peaceful protests. Okay, so like many of the people have commented on January 6th that many of the people there who protested January 6th, they were there, they were not there. They went in support of the president. They didn't invade the Capitol. They didn't do that. And the focus and the rest, have been on the people who committed acts of violence, not everyone who was present. So,
but to your point, Jeffrey, it was used to broad stroke all the conservatives, and it's amazing that they can't absorb that and how they're doing it the other side now. You know, is that the point you're making? Because I think that's important.
Yes.
Listen, I was around People's Park episode. Ronald Reagan was governor in California. There's the Vietnam War issues, the free speech movement, People's Park episode. We never had the Marines come in there. There was vandalism for sure, but it was handled by California, by Governor Reagan. And I repeat, compared to Los Angeles was a tea party.
We all know. I gotta remind you, Bruce.
Yeah.
Whenever you mention Ronald Reagan's name, you should be truthful. Okay.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan was a rhino who hated America, who was treasonous. Okay. So people have to remember he was a treasonous, B-level actor, C-level president who stood for nothing, and looked to sacrifice American values every opportunity he got, and when he went to meet with Gorbachev, he said, I'll give you the United States. I'm getting ready to give Russian classes to all the Americans so we can concede everything to you. This is the guy that won the Cold War. Okay.
Yeah.
So, now among the MAGA people, they shit on him. Okay. So, it's that they want a president, that Wall Street has, and people who put their money make there's some people who make their money running their mouths. Okay. There are other people who make their money by having skin in the game, by actually making bets on whether they do it through prediction markets, whether they do it through capital markets. But basically they have a conviction of their opinion, and they're willing to back up their conviction with money. I'm in that business. Okay. So I'm in the business of backing up my words with money. Okay. Skin in the game. Okay. And the people in skin in the game, where did the term come from? Taco Trump. It came from Wall Street saying, he's going to put these tariffs on. He's going to talk tough, but then he's going to give in. And that's some of the reason why, the markets have not collapsed, because they're not taking his words so seriously, because they think at the end of the day, he'll back down, on all this stuff. Nobody would refer to Reagan that way. Okay. Nobody would call Reagan a chicken. Even when Reagan pulled out of Lebanon, they call that an act of wisdom. Okay, not an act of weakness, an act of wisdom. Okay, and
well, remember the very first day, Jeffrey, the first days, the FAA strike. They didn't think that he was going to follow through. He did. That was the end of strikes under Ronald Reagan. That one among many examples.
Air traffic controllers. Yes,
yeah.
He stood tough. He broke the union, and basically that was the beginning of breaking the back of inflation. That was a very important event. That's when the country knew to take him seriously. Yeah. So that they learned to take him seriously. Reagan came in with double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. The misery index was over 20. Is with adding inflation to unemployment. I think when Trump became president, the misery index might have been. Inflation and unemployment might have been 6 or 7. Reagan when Reagan, it was like 24. So the difficulty in the differences in the circumstances, and in a period of time where Americans, for the most part, had a very low opinion of their own country. So the stock market was trading at like 35%, something like that, of replacement cost. So the stock market, since the Depression, the stock market had never traded at such a low value relative to replacement cost as when Reagan, was inaugurated as president. And we know what happened after that. The greatest job creating machine. America was respected all over the world again. Reagan and Thatcher led a revolution throughout the world. Russia, decided they didn't want to be socialists anymore, and that instead of being enemies and having a Cold War, they decided that they should join in the international organizations, and that we should get along, and if we not be friends, at least no longer be in a state of war, and and all that.
There's a lot to add
on
top of all. There's a lot to add on top of. I mean, I think it's interesting today. I don't think we can rightfully compare. I mean, I'm not disagreeing. I think today it's cartoonish compared to what we've seen in the past, but I think it's hard to compare the current presidency to president. There's just a different scene today. You know what I mean? I think that's a problem, both Americans and this country, as well as, how kind of a runaway train our government really is. But my point is there's a lot of things we could add about that I think we're also just as, in line with the larger agendas I'm seeing today. But I think what's, where it comes down to is the way that our government is used to divide people and to allow things like we're discussing. And so, like, for example, the idea of the deploying of military and the using of that to rationalize the next steps. I really think the Posse Comitatus Act conversation, the National Guard and the Marines, and the fact that we have Americans literally cheering that on is a sign of how dangerous this position is. I really am curious what the legalities from your guys' perspective is in this, because from what I understand, we have the Posse Comitatus Act is simple. There's the constitutional kind of opening. There's the act of Congress, which is like the Insurrection Act. And as far as I understand, those are the only two allowances, but if the National Guard is deployed and they're federalized, then that also becomes a possible violation, if I understand correctly. And so I think right now the point is not only have they been federalized, but they've even deputized them. ICE just put out a post saying that's the case. So as far as I can see, this is like a textbook example of a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. I was just curious what you guys think about that. And then I wanted to talk about like how that, if they claim that there's an invasion, does that change that? I mean, I just think this is immediately pressing, especially, I don't know if we're going to talk about it today, but with the ongoing bombing of Iran and how that plays into U.S. foreign policy. I see this all kind of in one discussion point personally, but what do you guys think?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the mentality, see, all of this goes back, in my judgment, to this idea that if you're an empire, you have to have a king or a Caesar. You can't have an empire without one. And so if you look at the absurdity of claiming that there's an invasion or rebellion in Los Angeles, and then Israel claiming that Iran is an existential threat to it, even though Israel has probably 400 nuclear warheads backed by the United States, and it's not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty like Iran. Iran has never attacked Israel in its life. And suddenly now it's an existential threat to Israel. No, Israel is an existential threat to Iran, not the other way around. But again, our involvement in the war, which is at least by providing systematically intelligence to aid the targeting and probably using U.S. planes to bomb these areas, again, it's all part of this mentality of the United States. We're an empire. We have to have an executive that can do whatever they want without any constraints whatsoever. I think that's the tie. And I do think that if you look about the Posse Comitatus, it's 1878. And part of it was a reaction to the fact that during Reconstruction, we had military districts that were running the South, the old Confederate states. Posse Comitatus says, unless Congress expressly authorizes otherwise, the military can't be involved in law enforcement. Now, there are two statutes, the Insurrection Act of 1807, and then there's another statute called the Armed Services Act, which say that in cases of invasion or rebellion, that you have such rioting that you cannot even enforce the law, then you can then use the military in these limited circumstances. But those words purport to have meaning. If they didn't have meaning, the language of the statute would say, whenever the president feels like it, he can decide to use the military or the Marines for law enforcement. It doesn't say that. Words supposed to have meaning. And there's no one in California who believes that there's an invasion and rebellion in the customary sense, in a non-political sense. So, and that's why a judge already initially issued a temporary restraining order that may or may not be a political question. But the issue that you've raised, Ryan, about violating these laws, it shows you that without Congress to enforce the laws by saying, if you don't faithfully execute the laws as required under Article 2, Section 3, we are going to impeach and remove you, because otherwise our laws mean nothing. You just sit back and do whatever you want, no matter what we've written, and that turns the legislative branch into nothing but a decoration. And that's one of the reasons why we are confronting every week when we discuss these, or more than that, these problems of executive overreach, is because Congress has turned into an ink blot.
Yeah.
It's not exercising the oversight powers it needs to. And people think, oh, if you impeach and remove a president, it will be like Latin American countries' revolving door. No, you do it once, it will not happen again. People who want the presidency want power. And they'll do anything to stay in power. You just need to do it once. It'll be 500 years. And anyway, it's just amazing. You go up on Capitol Hill, the illiteracy, the anemia up there, the no resolution to do any of this. And that's why the courts at best can put speed bumps in the road. But unless Congress recovers the backbone, we're done. We're going to end up with one branch government in one way or another.
Well, let me ask you both this.
I think that's why, Ryan, going back to what I think that's why I agree with Madison's comment. The fact is that when you have one party controlling all branches of government, you have tyranny, because ultimately what you have is the majority, the ruling party enables the president to be a lawless president. And that's as true as the Democrats enabling a Democratic president to be lawless as the Republicans enabling a Republican president to be lawless. So ultimately, nobody cares about the law. Nobody. I don't believe the courts care about the law. Okay, I think it's all about power, and I think that the whole system is corrupt. That's why, again, I call our system, it's not a constitutional republic. It's a crony, corrupt, corporatist cartel. That's our system. And it's unelected, okay? And those that are there are kakistocrats, okay, that are elected. Now, going back to your comment with respect to Israel, and I also view this as part of another lawless act. And why do I say it's a lawless act? I agree with everything Bruce said, but I'd like to add to it, okay? I view Israel as a proxy for the U.S. being able to fight a war against Iran because Iran didn't come to the table and agree to everything we wanted them to come to the table. So it's not like I think, we unleashed. Well, I think we clearly unleashed Bibi, because Bibi would not have done that without the authorization of the United States. We don't know, and we're probably never going to know, because we're never going to ask the questions on how much of the intelligence that they relied upon came from us. We don't know how much logistical support came from us. We don't know how much of the weapons they used came from us. So if we're their sponsor, and we're working in concert with them, but they're the ones piloting the planes that we provide them. They're the ones that are maneuvering the drones that we send them. They're the ones that are maneuvering the missiles that send them. The question is, are we aiding and abetting? Are we a co-conspirator? And therefore, are we as responsible for this? And was this a way for us to attack Iran without the president going to Congress and getting authorization to do so? So I believe that that's the case. I mean, I would like an investigation, but it's just hard for me to believe. It's not credible to me that Israel relied upon only munitions that they produced. Okay, I doubt that that's the case. Okay.
And we should include that Trump's already publicly more than once now alluded to and basically admitted that he knew and that he was involved. There's actually a report that came out of Israel, or from Times of Israel, stating that this was a plan that they agreed to the moment Trump was elected, and they just downplayed it this time to get Iran to relax. That's a report from Israel. But Trump's basically said in 2 different interviews now that he's agreed with it, he's okay with it, and basically involved with it. It's just important for people out there that were really pushing this whole Trump's pushing away from Israel, Netanyahu split. It seems to have been kind of a facade. Which, unfortunately, because I mean, I agree. I don't know where I stand on which side's pulling the other, but I definitely think it's impossible that this wasn't, both sides were aware of where this was going. And I think this has been kind of driven. Let's not forget that Trump and Vance and Vivek and everybody else, they were all really rabid about Iran right in the beginning of this administration. And as Jeffrey pointed out, they've floated this idea about, basically, like you were saying earlier, Jeffrey, like a gun to the head negotiating, do everything we tell you or we're going to bomb you. It's not a negotiation. So to pretend that Iran didn't go along with it is pretty dishonest, And I will point out as well, one more thing, that the original original JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, let's not forget that I think it was Article 36, if I remember correctly, literally gave them the right to do what they're doing should the U.S. do what they did. And that's a fact, you know, and so the whole thing is they immediately started saying, you're enriching uranium, but that was what they allowed them to do within the deal. And every country has the right to seek nuclear energy and nukes for that matter, but it's weird that they have this special version for Iran. But
no, there's further dishonesty here. One, I want to, Jeffrey, the international law language is we are a co-belligerent with Israel. When you are systematically providing military assistance to a country that's a belligerent, you are a co-belligerent, which means you can be attacked. But the dishonesty, let me explain this. It all stems from
before you get to this, Bruce. Before you get to this, I just have one question related to that point. How much? Because it's just what you said made me think about this. How much of some of the equipment Bibi asked that Trump supplied, that supposedly was asked for Israel to persecute or prosecute their war in Gaza, was really a distraction, and that the real issue of issuing those weapons was for Israel to have the weapons to strike Iran?
No, well, I have no doubt that they probably had dual use in Gaza and Iran as well. But and remember, this is we're trusting the judgment of a prime minister in Israel who, in 2002, testified before Congress. Oh, go ahead and invade Iraq. It'll be the democratic bellwether of all of the Middle East, and wow, democracy would be flowering there. That's the kind of judgment that Benjamin Netanyahu has. But I want to go back to the whole disingenuous dishonesty, all about this fear, hysteria about Iran acquiring a nuclear capability. It goes back to the 1969 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It says, without any moral foundation, 5 countries in the world get to have nuclear weapons and can use them. No others. How do you choose the 5? Well, the 5 that happen to have them right now: the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. You ask yourself, how come those 5 get to have nuclear weapons and nobody else does? Well, there really isn't any reason other than we got them and you don't. We're going to cram them down your throat. Now, Israel never has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and taking probably illegally uranium from the United States, enriched uranium. They now probably have like 400 nuclear warheads. Based upon the best estimates. Iran probably has none, but they may have some capability. But anyway, Iran did sign the it is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty says you can still have nuclear development for civilian purposes. Now, Israel, and then we go back to the Nuremberg Standard of post-World War II, where we decided that if you engage in aggressive war, that is a war not in actual self-defense, then that's a crime called crime against peace. And Nazis, for example, were convicted of crime against peace in attacking Poland when Poland wasn't attacking Nazi Germany. Although Adolf Hitler said Poland's an existential threat. Danzig, the corridor, existential threat, as justification. So if you look at Israel's claiming Iran's an existential threat to Israel. Israel's got 400 nuclear warheads, could destroy, Iran with nuclear weapons overnight. Really? Backed by the United States? Iran's having all these international boycotts and sanctions against it, an existential threat. I mean, that's utterly and completely Orwellian. Are you kidding me? The existential threat is the one that Israel has to Iran, not the other way around. And we sit there and say, oh, yeah, that's why we got to rally behind Israel. This is truly, utterly deranged thinking.
Yeah. And Israel's already claimed that this is we can discuss this if you guys like, the Orwellian ridiculousness of the preemptive self-defense attack, but they claim that already. And I believe that goes back to what the Bethlehem Doctrine, or that they have the right to attack. And I think it's only the US, the UK, and Israel that embody this or that use it, but that they can attack a country should they feel there's a coming threat. It's the same thing that Bolton tried to use in regard to Iran. It turned out to be basically them moving their own ships in their own harbors, but nonetheless, it spun out during the last administration.
If you got your Ryan, you hit on spot on the Achilles heel there that ends internet. If you can do preemptive self-defense, right? Well, I think they're going to attack me at some point in the future. Might be tomorrow, Could be 5 years. It could be 20 years. If they start learning high energy physics, they could develop a nuclear weapon. And that's the end of peace. Anybody can claim preemptive self-defense. It's an absurd concept that is the destruction of civilization, right? That's what it is. And of course, we ourselves have engaged in this kind of reasoning and attacks in the past as well. It's utterly absurd.
Right. Vietnam was a preemptive war, right? We were preempting the global spread of communism, right? That's what
the domino theory.
Exactly.
Theory.
Right.
I mean, all these things still weirdly continue today. I mean, all of it, everything we've talked about today, from the protests to the preemptive attacks to the, fighting back an ideology. I mean, that's all mixed together in the agenda we're seeing today. And it's all based on hyperbole. And,
at this point, Ryan and Bruce, I'm just reading now because it came across, from my the notifications I get on my iPad. The Pentagon, I'll read this. The Pentagon is positioning warships and other military assets in the Middle East to help protect Israel and American troops from possible Iranian retaliation to Israeli strikes. U.S. officials said on Friday the naval destroyer has moved into the area, and furthermore, military assets are moving into the area. So tell me we're not a participant in this war.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
We're basically providing Israel cover for Israel. And Netanyahu said this is not over. This is just beginning.
Yep. And Trump already admitted he removed troops from Iraq the day before. So he was already aware.
Yeah, it's obvious.
So why is Congress not calling up and saying, we're really a partner in this war, and you can't use the assets this way without getting our authorization because we're now an actor in a war.
Yeah. And again, it shows that Congress has diminished itself to what I call an ink blot. It basically is phased out because I think the political culture, has developed this idea that if you're an empire, we need to have a president with limitless power, got to be able to do whatever they want. Most of them don't even know what the war power is like. They don't understand the war power. They've never tried to enforce the war powers resolution, as weak as it is. They're going to have no debate whatsoever.
The resolution that should be up in Congress right now is stop funding Israel completely. Don't give them any weapons. Don't give them any financial support, and until they, de-escalate this completely, that all American financial and military support, including any sort of coordination and cooperation and logistical support, we should end. Let's see what Israel does now. If the U.S. would to sit back and say we're not a participant in the war. Let's prove it. Let's completely. And see if Israel's behavior is the same. If we really take a neutral stance, and a neutral stance means no logistical support, no financial support, no munition support, no support whatsoever. Okay, Israel uses weapons and they look to get resupplied. They have to rely upon their own capacity of supplying themselves. And let's see if Bibi talks the same way. Okay,
and at least
we're an actor in this war. Okay,
yeah, of course we are, and there's partial precedent for this. The analogy is not exact, but it's informative. When Congress finally got us out of the Vietnam War, they did, as you suggested, Jeffrey, by using the power of the purse. They passed a law that said after August 15th, 1973, no monies of the United States can be utilized to support any combat activities over into China. That was the end of it. And that's why in 1975, when the North occupied all of the South and Gerald Ford wanted to go back in, he couldn't. There was no money. So we know that can be done. Congress knows how to do this if it wants to stand up, which is exactly what we should do.
Well, the Iranian desire for a nuclear weapon, if that's the case, which they deny, but even if it is the case, okay, is legitimate, and for several reasons. One, because the point you mentioned is that Israel is more of an existential threat to Iran than Iran is to Israel. Okay, in spite of all the rhetoric and all the words, the facts on the ground, each country knows what the facts of the ground are and the differences and the asymmetry of the facts on the ground. The second reason is there's a very simple lesson to be learned, that other countries like North Korea has learned. Okay, and they learned it from a guy named Gaddafi. Okay, Surrender your nuclear weapon and you're dead, okay? What keeps you alive is the nuclear weapon, okay? So we have incentivized countries, to have nuclear weapons because we don't kill the country that has a nuclear weapon. We only attack, we're a bully. We only go after those that have no ability to defend themselves. So that's why we want countries to not have that. I mean, let's be honest about what we want. You talk about, the empire. We don't want any country. We know we can't take away from weapons from most of the countries that already have the nuclear weapons. We know we can't take it away. Okay. We can't bully them. Okay. So what we can do is we can bully everyone else. And a few of us that have nuclear weapons, we're happy to bully everyone else that doesn't from ever having one, so they never become a threat to us. And so the threat is always asymmetrical. Okay. We don't want to live in a world with symmetry. Okay. No. We want, and that's an unnatural state of affairs. That's an abuse of power. That's being a bully. We abuse our power. We're bullies. Okay. And countries have a right to defend themselves. Like they think that we think we need all these nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. Every other country has a right to think the same way. And you made a very valid point, is that Iran has signed on to the arms agreements, and from what has been the newspapers have been reported, the media's reported, is that they had agreed to even a stricter inspections regime than they previously had. So what's the problem?
And I'll add to that too, that it's not, and every single time this comes around, and as I understand it, they claim, I can't know for sure, that it's a religious issue, that they will never seek that, but the political momentum seems to be shifting because of these points to say, maybe we should anyway, because they're coming after us anyway. But let's not forget that every time this comes around, they will present a call for a nuclear-free Middle East. And of course, we can always say, oh, they're lying about it. But it's interesting, at the end of the day, every time it happens, every other country in the Middle East agrees, we'll go along with that. Iran says they'll get rid of everything if everyone's, including Israel, signs on. And every time Israel says no, and the U.S. backs up that, no, we don't want that because Israel refuses. And then blaming Iran somehow. There's so many examples like this that show you that we're being deceived about the real dynamics here. But I wanted to... Oh, go ahead.
I was just wanted to add, just to underscore how obtuse this is or how dishonest this is. The United States official policy is that we can never say Israel has nuclear weapons.
Right.
You get fired for saying, it's like you can't say there's oxygen in the air. Everybody knows Israel has nuclear weapons. In the Israeli Knesset, you can say Israel has nuclear weapons. But in the U.S. Congress and the executive branch, no. You cannot acknowledge that,
Very vivid
because somehow that would show that you're an anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite or whatever, to acknowledge what everybody knows is true. I mean, it shows you how warped, our relations are with Israel. This is freedom of speech that ought to be protected. You're just uttering something that everybody knows, including in Israel. What's the problem here?
Yep.
It's like being hysterical about anything being said that's truthful about the relations between the United States and Israel.
Netanyahu's been caught more than once in middle of briefings that are being live streamed, where he accidentally says something that makes it very clear that he knows, and he looks all embarrassed, and they keep going. It's silly that we don't acknowledge that. But I want to ask, in the larger sense, we're talking about Congress and the ability to stop these things. And so I think we've talked about this before, the concern that if Congress doesn't do anything at the peak moment, then nothing means anything. So let's say, as I think we're highlighting here, that whether, let's make it a broad point, and we can, whether it's a foreign country, lobbyists, it's clear to me that our politicians are influenced, if not completely controlled, through these mechanisms. So if we see that our if members of Congress are no longer even doing their duties, I wanted your thoughts, how do you fight back from that, Bruce? How do we get back to a point, logically, because that seems almost, insurmountable if they're all just completely in it for their own interests, and how do we get them back to actually trying to do the right thing to get us back on track?
It's a demanding challenge, but basically the system still has shown that it works. That is, if the public opinion, finding expression in emails, telephone calls, lobbying, visits, is sufficiently loud, Congress still pays attention. And I try to underscore 2013, when President Obama asked Congress, I want war against Syria because of chemical weapons use, whatever. Everybody bombarded, the public bombarded the members. No way, we do not want another war. The bill never even got out of committee. Even the super hawks like Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton said no, because the voices were there. And I always recall, even in a different issue concerning Watergate and the White House tapes, when the American people after the Saturday Night Massacre said, no, you need to comply with that grand jury subpoena, even after Nixon threatened not to. 30,000 telegrams in it, took $2, I think, to send a Western Union telegram. Congress went along and said, okay, we are going to remove you, unless you comply. And remember, this was against a president, not like Trump, but by a president who had won 60% plus of the popular vote in 1972, 520 electoral votes, overwhelming public mandate, if you could, in 1972 over George McGovern. He won Mr. Nixon won 49 states. And the public said, no, you don't have a mandate to violate the Constitution. And Congress did respond. That is the only way that we can get Congress to respond. It's got to be systemic. And in some sense, it's easier because you can send in emails much easier than Western Union telegrams. The demonstrations are important, the ones on June 14th. But let me pause for a second to focus on tomorrow. And this is supposed to be under the banner of no kings. I say no kings? No, not just no kings. Nobody gets to violate the Constitution. That's what we comply with. We're not satisfied just with not having a king. Are you kidding? The Constitution says, well, anything short of kingship's okay. No. I mean, that shows, I think, how warped our minds have come in our culture, and believing a president, well, he's not quite anything short of being a king or a queen. That's okay. But a king goes too high, when he starts wearing a crown. He stands up and says, okay, I'm not going to wear a crown, but I'll still exercise infinite power. That shows that the enormous educational mission we have to enable the American people to understand what form of government we have.
No, to emphasize this point, Bruce, I think that regarding public demand on behalf of the Constitution, and that we need to speak up if Congress refuses to, and we must force them to, and we have the ability to force them to if we have the will to force them to. And again, force does not mean we commit violence. Force means we have our words heard. That we engage in activism, peaceful, constructive activism. And an example of like the type of stupid things people say, with respect to people say illegal immigrants, when they say, oh, it's a threat to security and the Democrats are protecting, violent actors in the sense of here we know they're not sending off the worst of the worst of the worst. Okay. Yeah. So we know that that's not happening. We know they're going into courts where people are showing up for hearings for either their asylum hearings or to become citizens. So they're going to places where people are working. They're going to schools. They're going to hospitals. They're going to all these places. So they're not picking up the worst of the worst of the worst of these people. They look at people who came in here undocumented and are now trying to become documented. Okay, and that seems to be most of who they're picking up now. Okay, and people think they have no right to due process, that they're a threat to. So someone who's been in the country period of time, who has never committed any violent act, never committed a crime against another person, okay, they're a threat to national security and should not be entitled to due process. We should pick them up, put on a plane, send them to Libya, South Sudan, El Salvador, Antarctica, or wherever, But apparently, I guess serial killers. I don't see many people saying we should just, anyone who commits, is the point that anyone who commits violent crime, they're not subject to a jury trial? Should we just find any criminal, forget the trials? And is this what American people think we should go back? Because they're clearly a bigger threat than these illegals who have come here and the only crime they've committed is they're undocumented. Okay.
Yeah. So, Jeffrey, I want to pause this
person who's been here for years and never committed an act against another person, okay, seems to be less a risk to our security than criminals who rob and commit criminal acts. So are we basically supporting a justice system where there is no trial juries and there is no due process, that we just shrink people up? Because that seems to be the consequences of what people want, because those people are a threat, okay? They are a real threat. So are we talking about just trashing the whole Constitution? Nobody's really entitled to a trial, in a criminal charge, to a jury trial, and there should be no due process. We'll just let the cops shoot everybody they want to shoot and give them immunity. This seems to be the world people want.
Yeah, no, well, and we want to underscore as well, I repeat this, this is not just academic musing. We know what happens when you don't do due process. Spectacular case during World War II. No due process for 120,000 Japanese Americans, allegedly disloyal, planning espionage, sabotage, 120,000 errors. Every single one was an error. And we ultimately apologized through Congress, made some reparations. That's what happens when you don't do due process. And I'd like to point out that even at Nuremberg, we charged high-level officials in the Nazi administration with the most horrible of crimes. But there were a handful who were ultimately acquitted, 3, because they had due process. They had an opportunity to look at the evidence, challenge it, and make arguments as to what the law was or not. There's nobody who can just look out in their eyes without opportunities for cross-examination and say, you're guilty or not. How do you know until you have a trial?
This comes back.
You can't tell whether someone is in the country illegally until you have an opportunity to respond.
Right.
And I always emphasize.
Look, the cop knows. Give him a gun. Let them shoot whoever they want. Let's assume that every shooting is a good shoot. And in case they make a mistake, give them immunity to make sure that there's no consequences for the mistake. Let's be clear. That's the world Trump wants. I'm not exaggerating, and I don't think what I'm saying is an exaggeration.
No,
not at all. Jeffrey,
that's the world he wants.
Yeah, illustrate your point with a little humor. So this was a time in the 1950s, the communist conspiracy and hysteria, whatever. So there's a policeman. He's in New York City. He's using his baton to break up a demonstration, supposedly for communists. And somebody stands by and says, Mr. Policeman, I'm an anti-communist. The policeman responds, I don't care what kind of a communist you are. I'm going to get you all, right?
Right.
So, I mean, that's the mentality. Complete moronic stupidity,
But I want
to be brutal force.
I want to point out, though, and I agree. The thing is clearly who knows what they want or who's driving their intentions, but what they're carrying out. I agree. That's what's happening. But I don't know how many Americans truly want that, or are just being contorted into some mental gymnastics to rationalize, that until we bring it all back because we're saving the country, or, a whole multitude of manipulations, or some people that don't even actually think they're doing that, that they're being rationalized in some way to think they're fighting, it's like we said earlier, it's the other. They've turned these into, dehumanized others, and whoever we're fighting, it's always in the best interest of America, and so I think what's important to talk about this in, like the protest example we discussed, the invasion. I want to play this clip, Jeffrey, if I could, the protest point back to June 14th. And then I also want to bring up some of those clips about the illegal immigration overlap to show the kind of bigger picture of, the dishonesty around this. Like, so we're talking about here is the idea that we're, basically rationalizing the removal of the Constitution, as Jeffrey's talking about. And so in this clip right here, here's Donald Trump now escalating this. If you can bring that up for me, Jeffrey, the clip right there. If not, it's okay. I can just describe it. But the point is that he's sitting in the Oval Office and he's literally saying that and this is about his birthday protest. This is the same conversation.
Is this the right one?
Yeah. Let's do it real quick.
If there's any celebrating big on Saturday, we're going to have a lot of, and if there's any protest that wants to come out, they will be met with very big force. By the way, for those people that want to protest, they're going to be met with very big force. And I haven't even heard about a protest, but this is people that hate our country. But they will be met with very heavy force.
So really quickly, 3 times he says that, not if they do something wrong, but just if they protest. And it's typical Trump hubris or whatever you want to call it. But I don't even know about the protest they're all talking about that everyone's know. It's like he's trying to act like it's not important, so he doesn't know about it, but then says that they're all anti-American. The protest you don't know about, or it's just so crazy. how dishonest it all is. But the bottom line is, if you protest against me, you're anti-American. And then if you protest in any way, you'll be met with violence.
America was
that's an escalation.
created. America was created by an act of protest. Okay, nothing is more American than the right to protest. Okay, maybe he should read Thomas Jefferson. Okay, not only is there a right to protest, according to Thomas Jefferson, guy wrote the Declaration of Independence. For any MAGA person out there, there's a document called the Declaration of Independence. I know you think July 4th is about eating barbecue and going to the beach. Okay, you probably don't know what Independence Day means. It's not the day that we put tariffs on the world. Okay, it's the day we celebrate a document called the Declaration of Independence. It was written by a guy named Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so for most of you MAGA people, you probably don't know any of this. So so I'll let you know. Thomas Jefferson insisted, not only is it our right, it's our obligation. It's our obligation when our government acts illegally. And an illegal government is a government that acts in conflict to the Constitution, okay? That it is our obligation to protest. It is our obligation to do acts of dissent, okay? It's our obligation to do so. And the only way we can preserve our constitutional republic is being vigilant in doing so, okay? So his statement, okay, is a statement made by a despot, by a tyrant, by an autocrat, okay? His statement is made by an authoritarian ruler, okay, who only respects force, not rule of law, but rule by force, okay? And he is anti-American. He's the one that hates America, okay? And he's the one that's trying to transform America, to resemble more, and I know people don't like this reference, to resemble more Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Okay, and so for people who don't like the analogies between ICE and the Gestapo, look, the Gestapo did not operate all the concentration camps, but they brought the people to the camps. Okay, and what is not and what they get dressed up, they just picked people off the streets. That there was no due process. They picked people up and brought them to a camp. Okay, and initially, remember the concentration camps in the beginning. Well, some people will argue that that death camps didn't exist, but they all acknowledge that concentration camps exist, that at least a camp existed that was a detention camp, whether there doesn't need to be much dispute that people were brought to detention camps. So what did the Gestapo do? They brought people to detention camps, okay? What is ICE doing? They're bringing people to detention camps. They're masked. They won't provide their identity. I saw a video of some woman, two women that were speaking to some agents, and they were picking up someone who was gardening there, and they asked the agents to identify themselves, and they refused. They wouldn't show them any credentials. So how do you know they're even ICE agents? People can get people can go in there and get a uniform and start picking people up, and get, and falsifying a car and falsifying this type of identity, and just start picking people up if they don't identify themselves.
That's actually happened, Jeffrey. Did you know about that? I
heard it's happening. Yes.
So somebody got robbed. You can buy an ICE jacket on Amazon for very little. Somebody went into a store dressed like ICE, apparently tied everybody up and robbed the store and left. And I guarantee that's happened more than we know about.
Yeah, yes. Jeffrey, I would say the famous quote assigned to Thomas Jefferson was, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." That's Thomas Jefferson for you. Right. Now, the other thing that's I think telling about Mr. Trump's statements is that once he says there's going to be force against anybody who.
But Thomas Jefferson had the wrong God. Trump's the God. So being obedience to God is meaning being obedient to Trump.
Yeah. Well, anyway, but now notice the language Trump's used when he says that. First, he says that anybody who comes to protest on his birthday in the military parade, force will be used against him. And then he says that they hate America because he is likening himself. Trump is America. Right. That's Louis the 14th, right? The state. I am the state. So that's the mentality of Mr. Trump. He thinks he's King Louis the 14th, or he later identifies himself with Napoleon. Well, as Napoleon says, if you're saving the country, you don't violate any law. This is what goes through his head. Now, he was also said, I think he was asked whether he'd ever read Mein Kampf, which is kind of Adolf Hitler's Bible. This is like, she doth protest, methinks too much, where he then was vigorously denying that, well, he actually read Mein Kampf, although his former wife reportedly told his lawyer that he had a copy, or at least a collection of Adolf Hitler's speech on his bedstand here. But surely I believe that his effort to manipulate public mind fits Mein Kampf like a glove. Fine people, Hitler jumped on Jews. Donald Trump is using immigrants as Hitler's Jews. And he thinks you can dehumanize, get everybody to hate them, then and using that as and inflating the flea into an elephant, then I can use limitless powers. Because Adolf Hitler regularly said, well, Jews are infecting the race. We have to destroy them. You got to give me limitless power. That's the only way I can save Anglo-Saxons. And I believe that Mr. Trump is following that playbook right now.
Guys, I've only got about 20 minutes left. So could I bring up some of the clips to make a good point off of that? And then we can discuss.
Go ahead, Brian. Yeah.
So this clip, don't bring it up just yet. This clip right here that I've pulled up, and you can bring it up, I can pause it, is an interesting overlap. So what we're discussing is obviously how this is all being used, right? And so it's interesting that at the same time they're using the other, and of course we've all talked about Noam and Bondi and Heggs, all the statements they've made about how this is just and Miller, just like exactly almost borderline like the terminology used during World War II, like just othering these people, dehumanizing. And so now all of a sudden Trump is now arguing, I think we even touched on before, there was one moment where he said that he'll give passes to certain people on certain farms. Well, he's come out, I'm sure you guys have seen, and are saying that, basically in certain groups or certain inner circle people they're connected with, farms, hotels, leisure, that they're going to allow illegal immigrants. And he makes it very clear.
Statement today about
he makes it clear that illegal immigrants, which I found an interesting distinction from last time, even though we knew what he was talking about. And then I'll play one more up next about this and overlapping with Chinese immigrants. And just think about how crazy this is with all that they've built up. There are MAGA people out there that are like, every illegal immigrant has to go, which, I'm of the mind that if you're breaking the law, that matters, right? But there's nuance to these conversations. And here's what he said. I think this was yesterday or today.
Look, today I put out a statement today about farmers. Our farmers are being hurt badly by, they have very good workers. They've worked for them for 20 years. They're not citizens, but they've turned out to be, great. And we're going to have to do something about that. We can't take farmers and take all their people and send them back because they don't have maybe what they're supposed to have, maybe not.
Wow.
And you know what's going to happen and what is happening? They get rid of some of the people because, you go into a farm and you look and people they've been there for 20, 25 years and they've worked great and the owner of the farm loves them and everything else. And then you're supposed to throw them out. And you know what happens? They end up hiring the people, the criminals that have come in, the murderers from prisons and everything else. So we're going to have an order on that pretty soon, I think. We can't do that to our farmers and leisure too, hotels. We're going to have to use a lot of common sense on that. If you look today, I put out a statement today.
Go ahead.
The hotels that he's using, that Trump hotels, that's exactly right. And it reminds me.
Suddenly they're not illegals.
Yeah, right.
Suddenly they're not
maybe they have what
illegals.
they need, maybe not. Like the Blythe way he discusses that as they're like demonizing anybody and sending to foreign prisons for having a visa. Sorry, it's just so
No, I was
crazy.
going to say, I remember anybody who's in the horse world knows that like 99% of the workers there, the groomers, they're all here illegally. They're unauthorized. And it always caused me some amusement to see Lou Dobbs. Lou Dobbs is very rich, and he goes down in Florida. He has all these show horses, whatever this daughter rides, using and benefiting all on these illegal aliens. And he's the voice that goes high octaves, how horrible this all is. But hey, when it benefits him, he looks the other way. So it just shows how unprincipled and
What did he just acknowledge? While he's keeping troops in that California and people protesting it, he just acknowledged that his administration is not demonstrating common sense. That's what he said, right?
Yeah.
He said, we got to find a way to solve this problem with common sense. Okay,
Yeah.
which means that they're not using common sense. So he just acknowledged his program of dealing with illegal immigrants, undocumented people, okay, lacks common sense. Okay.
Definitely.
Finally, Trump might have come up with something unwittingly that was an honest statement.
Unwittingly,
Okay?
of course.
You know,
But what's
unwittingly, because
interesting,
I don't think he didn't probably mean it that way.
Yeah.
But because he has so much verbal diarrhea, saying so much bullshit that he can't remember all the bullshit that he says. You know, that periodically out from bullshit comes an unwittingly, unknowingly, you know, honest statement. And the honest statement that he made is, yes, your program does lack common sense. And Trump, I'm glad you acknowledge that your program lacks common sense.
but to
Not
another
only
point,
does it
Jeffrey,
lack
that you
common
touch on,
sense, I'll tell you, it lacks common decency. Okay,
Mm.
not just common sense, it lacks common decency. Okay.
to another point that you touched on right there is the overlap of the protesters, right? So think about this. They are using military force. Well, obviously the narrative is shifted into somehow Mexican invasion, but in the beginning part of it was because these
Funded
people
by the
are
Chinese.
rioting and they're
Mexican
violent.
invasion funded by the Chinese.
Or the Chinese, depending on who you want to listen to, right? But what's crazy is that you're using violence to shut down people who are verbally protesting against what you just acknowledged is a nuance. That there are people who are not breaking the laws, people who are even not illegals, but have visas. But we all know this conversation. So this is my point about average people in the middle of all this who go like, what, you know, they look at both these things and I think they just don't know where to turn. Like, I'm of the mind that most people outside of the screaming party, you know, spotlight are pretty unnerved about where this all goes right now. And I mean, that's what gives me hope, I think. But
but great. You've come on a great point, Ryan, and one that Jeffrey made too. If Trump should have been out there protesting his own policies, because he should be the one saying, hey, this doesn't make any common sense according to his own words, right? He should be he should have a sign out in Los Angeles. This doesn't make any sense, you know, do something, use common sense. So I know that's why you say, well, I don't know what to call it, schizophrenia or whatever, you know, believing two opposite ideas at the same time. It goes back, I say, to some humor. And one of the novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald's called the Crack Up. He says that in Washington, D.C., the earmark of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposite ideas in the mind at the same time and yet retain the ability to function. Right? That's what he tried. Right? Okay. How do you do that? You know, you have two opposite ideas and you can still function, not be paralyzed. Anyway, that's
Ryan, before you leave, do you want to put up that other clip?
yeah, I've got it ready. So this one, before you pull it up, is about the same kind of conversation, but overlapping this with Chinese immigrants and students coming in. So this is not just about illegal immigrants, or not about illegal immigrants, but the Chinese student visas. And so even more so to me, this is hypocritical in comparison to people like Khalil, Ozturk, and all these others that were, you know, no criminal charges here legally, and because they said certain things. So this one's about China, and I'll point out real quickly. I'll point out that people like Loomer and Johnson and some others are really adamant about the point that China is invading this country. So juxtaposing these next to each other, I think is humorous, but here it is.
I've always been in favor of students coming in from other countries. That includes China. And we have 500.
As long as they don't go to Harvard.
Chinese students coming in. I've always been in favor of it. Does it mean that you have to watch people? Yeah, you have to watch students, but you have to watch other people also. I've always been strongly in favor of it. I think it's a great thing. It's good for our schools. I think it's good for our country. I'm also in favor of having them stay. I've been in favor of letting them stay. If you get educated for 4 years, you're willing to get educated for 4 years. I like people being able to stay. You know, they have some great students. You have some.
All right, Jeffrey, go ahead. You can barely contain yourself. It's just such hypocrisy. It's insane.
Where is his proposal? Where is his immigration proposal that he's supposedly he's now been president, you know, collect, because he was always, not recently, always. Okay. So he's now been president for almost 5 years, you know, between his first term and now his second term. Where was the proposal that any Republican has made, you know, that he's endorsed, that all the Chinese students that want to come are welcome, okay? And not only are they welcome to come, after they graduate, they're going to be given their citizenship. Where is that proposal that he says he's always been for? He's the guy that ended up having the negotiations with trying to break off in the trade agreement, because he was the one who banned all Chinese students from coming into was that him? Or was it some clone of him? You know, was it
But
Stephen Miller putting
it's
words
even
into
more
his mouth?
lunatic,
This
Jeffrey
is the guy
and
that
Brian.
less than a month ago, he wanted no Chinese students in the country. And now he says, not only is he for them coming in, he wants to give them citizenship rights. And if anyone who wants to come from China should come and study here. And that he's always been for that.
But it's even more lunatic than that, Jeffrey and Ryan, because this is the same president who says, notwithstanding the U.S. Congress saying China's control over TikTok, it's a national security threat.
Right.
China, and yet he's not even going to enforce the law against what is admitted a Chinese national security threat. Now, try to make that compute with his 7 different views on whether we want Chinese students here in the United States. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason anyway. It is like living every day through the Mad Hatter's Tea Party and Alice in Wonderland. If you want to, I highly recommend that to anyone. Read the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, and then you'll kind of be able to get through each day in Washington, D.C.
And I'll leave you guys with this. I mean, it's chaotic, but in a positive note, because people are seeing what I think is the truth. A lot of people in the conservative side of this, like large commentators, are calling this out right now. People that have been like lockstep with this agenda until now are saying, hold on, I've been spearheading your movement for no illegal immigrants, and now you turn, so it's caused a big rift. So I think that's a positive thing.
But next week he'll be saying, "I never said that."
Yeah.
And everybody will be cheering him. Okay.
Right.
And then anyone who brings this video up will be picked up, deported, and sent to South Sudan or somebody like that for showing this video. So that's the one thing about Trump. He says this today, people respond, then he'll deny he ever said it. And the people that follow him will accept that explanation that he never said it. And then after he says, "I never said that," if Ryan, you post this clip again, people will call you deranged, that you suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. Okay. Right. That trip doesn't exist, that it was doctored, it was AI. They'll come up with some reason of calling you deranged. So this is what Trump can get away with. He can say something, "I always said it. I never said it. I sometimes said it. I might have said it. No, I never said it." And he can say all of that stuff in the same conversation, okay? And people will believe every one of those things he says, even if they're in complete contradictions to each other, okay? So that's how that's why I mostly blame the American people, how stupid they could be to believe anything that comes out of this guy's mouth.
But part of that, Jeffrey, I think, is because our culture has become so decayed educationally that we no longer raise people who actually have critical thinking. They just, they just become echo chambers of what they hear. They don't actually think anymore.
And worse, Bruce, they're taught that is intelligence, right?
Yeah. They taught it because you can press AI or get something. You can press buttons and you can do mathematics or something. You don't have to know multiplication tables anymore. And that's what I say is the real long-term threat or the destruction of the United States. I've often pointed out that I believe that the beginning of civilization itself was the idea, I could be wrong. I need to listen. There can be different ways of looking at this. That's what makes us human beings. We have brains. We're not just reptiles, but the educational system, it's the opposite. Maybe I was spoiled because my educational prime was at the time of Sputnik, and we thought we had to really learn something in order to avoid being buried by the Soviet Union. That is long gone. I mean, we just had, for example, at the Kennedy Center, Les Miserables is being performed. He said, I doubt whether there's a single person in attendance there, certainly Mr. Trump and his wife, who've ever read Les Miserables, who know who Jean Valjean is, who know who Javert is. It doesn't exist,
I don't know if you saw it. They showed a clip of somebody asking him a question of which of those two characters he most identified with. Yeah. And his response was, I don't know. That's a tough question. Okay. And then he asked Melania to answer on his behalf. I don't know what happened after that, but he was asked which of those two characters he identified most with. And he thought that was a tough question. Okay?
I'm surprised he didn't say both simultaneously or something like that.
Yeah,
but
well, he
I'm
probably
not
didn't
gonna
know
break it up,
that
guys.
one was he didn't know one was the inspector and the other one was the hero. You know, I know. Listen, it's not plausible. Just Les Miserables like 1,000 pages long. It takes a long time to get through it. There's no chance that Donald Trump has ever read that novel. No way. I doubt whether Melania has as well. It's real. It's a serious work to get through. It's like
She seemed to
reading
blank out
Wernick.
because I think also, yes, she said, "What? I don't understand the question." Well, these people in the show, I listened to the music, but I have no idea who the characters were, and I can't even identify who was the hero and who was the villain.
Well, guys, great chatting as always. I look forward to these every time. So I'm looking forward. I'm sorry, I have to break off. I've got moments before I have to be somewhere else. So thanks, guys. Always a great conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Contribution is invaluable, but yeah. That's,
You can't make this stuff up, really.
no, you can't. This is life imitating art, isn't it, Jeffrey? You can't make it up, man. Oh my God.
So, Bruce, is there anything that you want to talk about on this Friday? Before we wrap it up.
Well, just the last thing I would focus on. We have some remaining weeks now with the U.S. Supreme Court, and I still think that's going to be very important test of whether or not it stands up and at least gives us some breathing space to continue to at least have some semblance of a rule of law, or whether they're just going to capitulate. I don't think the signs are clear one way or the other. Right now, unfortunately, again, they're using the shadow docket and issuing these interim stay orders without full briefing to decide very, very major questions. But that's what I just flagged that, Jeffrey. It's just we're now at June 13th, and usually it finishes its term at the end of June. So in the next 2 weeks, just keep your eyes on the Supreme Court decisions. They'll be critical with regard to the rule of law and how deferential they are to the executive branch. But on the larger sense, what we're talking about, and I do believe that there's a very close connection between Los Angeles and Israel's attack on Iran, is that we got to get out of this idea that we're not an empire. We are, and all this, this is seamless if you understand that empires have to have Caesars. Empires have to have limitless executive power. And that's what we're seeing. The illegal co-belligerency against Iran, the illegal claim that somehow we're subject to an invasion and rebellion out in California. We need the military to enforce the law, even though 99% of the protesters are peaceful. And until we, as a culture, reject this idea that we need limitless executive power because we'd rather be an empire than to march to our own drummer and celebrate liberty, we're going to be coming back to this problem over and over and over again. And that's the ultimate source of, I believe, the deformation of the Constitution.
Yeah. And I think like this case of going back to, us now sending reinforcements to the region, if it's under the guise of protecting our soldiers that are there, well, then which party put those soldiers at risk? It was Israel that put our soldiers at risk. So I don't know why we're defending the country that put our soldiers at risk. That doesn't seem to make sense. So, or the second thing we could do is just, if our soldiers at risk, remove them from harm's way. Yeah. So if this is, supposedly a lot of the people in the Make America Great movement, the America First movement was, and this is what a point that Vance had made, supposedly made, is that we should not interfere. We're not interfering. Is that what the statement made? We're not interfering with other countries anymore.
Yeah.
Is this an absence of interference? I think this is very interfering. So we are interfering where we want to interfere, and then we're using the bullshit excuse that we don't want to interfere where we don't want to interfere, but there's no philosophical principle of non-interference. Okay. So that statement is just bullshit. It's a pure lie. Okay. It's just bullshit. So here we are interfering. If we don't want to interfere, this very simple way of not interfering. It's just remove all our troops from the region, so we eliminate them from being harm's way. Remove our destroyers, remove our aircraft, stop funding this stuff, and that way, we'll make those words mean something. And it goes back to the point that we started off with. This is our words mean nothing. We've made our words. Our government has made words devoid of meaning. Okay,
Yeah.
They've destroyed language. They've destroyed communication. Okay, this is what the government does: destroyed communication. Okay, and without the ability to communicate, no problem can get solved. So that's why we see no problem getting solved, because what they're destroying is language, words, and communication. And so they have nothing left other than the use of force to resolve disputes.
That's right. I call that, we resort to the Kalashnikov culture. If you can't communicate, then the only one way to resolve things is by force, guns, weapons, things of that sort. And then we regress then to Neanderthal man, Croatian man, and things like that. The idea that, I think it's a Western idea more than Eastern, that somehow there's an inevitable progressive evolution of the species, to sort of greater heights of morality and wisdom. It's complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. My view of things, reading a lot about what our level of morality and wisdom was 250 years ago compared to today, we've gone backward at least a century and a half, if not more.
Yeah, I want to give an illustration, okay, of what I think a leader with decency, wisdom, humanity, and even strength, how they should have handled, the California situation. Okay, so if we had a president who had any of those attributes, which unfortunately we don't, okay, would have called up Newsom and said, "Hey, I'm seeing, some videos that are disturbing to me. Can you let me know what the circumstances are on the ground? I'm a little concerned. Let's stay in contact. I want to let you know I'm here at your disposal in case you need if you need any help, and let's talk every day, because this is disturbing to, to many people, the images that they have to say, and please keep me informed, and here are my concerns." And that's a reasonable person having a reasonable conversation where you're looking to accomplish something constructive. Okay. Anyone who behaves differently than that, okay, is not looking to solve a problem, and they're not looking for anything constructive, that their behavior is destructive. Okay. So first you give the opportunity of people to engage in conversation, and you solve a problem. And the question is do the people, no one can come up and say she's liberating the people from California, from the government, but it doesn't seem to be supporting that the Californians are supporting their version of liberation. So they're imposing a solution that is not a welcome solution on the people. So the people, I don't think Californians, from what I read and hear, feel secure now with this president, with the presence of, Trump, imposing the federal government on California. I don't think the people feel safer. They seem to feel less safe, not safer. So you got to look at what the real objectives are. So people sitting to talk about it, and forget about his lie that he saved the city and would all be burning and whatever. That's all his bullshit. That gets repeated all over the place and goes back to your citing Mark Twain. That the
lie is halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on.
Yeah. So, but it's I don't know if people really even. You would hope that the American people, independent of ideology, would want to have a leader who understands the moral obligation of being a leader. Okay, independent of ideology. Okay, there's certain attributes a leader has. Again, independent of whether they're left wing or right wing or centrist or whatever. There's just common rules of decency that are independent of political philosophy and political ideology, and Trump is clearly an agent of chaos who doesn't look to constructively solve, any problem. And the only reason he's probably interested now in making these claims about, the Chinese students studying here and concerns about the farmers is because a group that's aligned with him has expressed a concern to him. So it's not based upon any sort of philosophical issue. It's that maybe somebody came up to him and a lot of farmers said, hey, people aren't showing up to work. This is going to be devastating for us. And he says, holy shit, this is my base. I got to do something because they're my base, not because they're American, but they're part of his base. If they're not part of his base, they're not American to him. Okay. So, and many people in the base also think that way, that if they're not part of the base, they're not American and also don't deserve, these benefits. And yes, of course, he owns hotels and other people own hotels, and maybe they're all starting to suffer. And when he gets together with his friends, they say, hey, you're a moron. Don't you know what the consequences are? And his buddies are calling him, telling him how stupid his policy is, and so now he's got to come back and say, I got to sit back and say, I need to change things, not because it's a philosophical thing, but it's because it's hit people who he has relationships with, who he doesn't want those relations damaged. He doesn't want to be perceived in a bad way by those people. So he's doing it for the wrong reason. It might be the right thing, but he's doing the right thing for the wrong reason. A good leader, does the right thing for the right reason, not periodically does the right thing, for wrong reasons. He does things, almost everything he does for the wrong reason. So
yeah. I want to, if I can just close again, and maybe I'm repeating myself,
sure,
Jeffrey, but I think that this is important. It illustrates, what it means to do to act as a leader in his own way, acting for the right reason, being more important than anything else. And to go back, this is the passage in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, where Huckleberry Finn has to decide whether he's going to return Jim to his slave owner, Miss Watson. And he reflects on all his Christian teaching, saying that he's going to go to hell if he doesn't return Jim to Miss Watson. He thinks about all the friendship that has been displayed by Jim, helping him out on various crises. And he thinks, and he says, well, I guess I'll go to hell. That's leadership. That's moral leadership. If he has to go to hell to do the right thing, he'll still go to hell. That's the kind of people we need at the helm today.
Well, thank you very much. Those are great citations, Bruce, as always, and thank you, and have a great weekend, and
I'll be out there with a sign that doesn't say no, not only no kings, no constitutional violations. That's more important.
let's hope we can go and enjoy a day without a constitutional violation.
Yeah. Exactly.
Take care, Bruce.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.